Hello, friends. Welcome back to the While We're Waiting Hope After Child Loss podcast. I'm Jill Sullivan, your host and one of the co-founders of the While We're Waiting ministry. This is a podcast of stories of devastating loss and grief and heartbreak and struggle, and stories of hope and healing and faith and, yes, even joy. Underlying every conversation is the hope we have in Jesus Christ, which makes it possible to not just survive the loss of a child, but to live well while we're waiting to see them again in heaven one day. You can learn more about our ministry and the free bereaved parent retreats we host by visiting our website at www.whilewe'rewaiting.org. Welcome to episode number 238, which is a continuation of my conversation with Courtney Mount, whose daughter Millie died from neuroblastoma cancer in July of 2020. Courtney is a homeschooling mom of 9, a blogger, a freelance writer, and the author of the Millie Finds Her Miracle collection. Her latest book is titled She Died, I Didn't, a mother's story of surviving grief, sustaining faith, and recognizing miracles along the way. I believe our conversation will help you see that there truly is hope to be found after child loss, and that it is possible to live a full life even in the shadow of grief. I'm glad you've joined us today. You talk in the book, too, about how going back to church was a real struggle for you, and that was true for me as well. Talk about that.
Well, you'll always find our family on the second row on the left-hand side, right up where the pastor can see me. So Every Sunday morning, I would go to Sunday school and I would be okay. Sunday school was okay. You have to remember that I have a crush on the teacher. So, my husband's the teacher.
That's true. Yeah.
And it is funny, I will back up just for a second and say this. Not too long ago, we studied Lazarus and he said something in Sunday school and I couldn't. I was so upset with him and he saw my face and afterwards he came to me and he just said, honey, that's not what I meant. And then we were able to even grieve over that together because I knew his heart versus what his mouth said.
Right. So, sure.
But Anyway, I'd go to Sunday school and Sunday school would be fine. By the time I got to worship service, I was totally spent. Music would start, so would my tears. I would cry and I would cry. And I did sing. I've sang all along. I didn't have a point where I couldn't sing worship music. But that's when I felt like I could just really be one with the Lord and hear him hear my sorrow so clearly as I sang and the tears fell. But I don't remember much of what was preached. And during that time, we didn't have a consistent pastor. We had a lot of visiting pastors. And they would always sit on the pew in front of me. And I would always say, I need you to know I'll start crying as you preach. It's not your preaching. Just keep on going and don't look at me. So I just cried every week. By the time the invitation came, my mind was just darting. How am I going to get out of this room? I have got to get out of here. Should I go to the bathroom? Maybe I should sneak out the back door. Like I said, we're right up front. And I just struggled with, I can't be here any longer. I can't take this. After church, I would immediately head for the car. We would get home. And I would come straight to our room, shut my door, lock it, close the curtains, and lay down and sleep the rest of the day. I didn't feed my family. I didn't even ask if they ate. I actually didn't even care if they ate. I felt so worn out. The grief was so exhausting. And David was such a good guy to just step in. He fed them every week. He took care of them every week. He never said, is today my day that I get to go and bury my head in the bed? He didn't do those things. And I would ask him, where do you cry at? And he said, I cry as I drive to work. He has an hour-long commute to work. And he said, that's where I cry at. Or his office, his desk faces a corner. And he said, I've never been so thankful my computer faced the corner. I just sit and cry and nobody knows.
Oh, wow.
And I wouldn't share all that, Jill, but he's given me full permission to share. He said, if it helps another parent, please do.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because I know guys struggle with sharing their grief and being real and honest about it.
Right. Well, my husband does not struggle with that at all. So
no, he does not.
And that's a wonderful thing. It really is. What was the point where you began to be able to deal with going to church a little bit better, where it didn't just wipe you out for the day?
Probably about 1.5 to 2 years in.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's still periodically times I had a moment where my granddaughter came to church, and she came up and sit on my lap, and doesn't normally go to our church. And I just snuggled her and I just cried into the top of her hair. And when she said, I need to go back to mama, I said, go ahead, get down, go back to mama. And then I leaned over and told David, I'm like, she weighs the same that Millie weighed.
Oh,
She actually had one of Millie's dresses on that day.
oh my goodness.
But she's a brown-headed kid, and Millie was a blonde, and there was a little bit of differences. And then, funny enough, the pastor came off stage, and he was a pastor that had been there when Millie was sick. And he laughed, and he said, that one sits a little stiller than Millie did. And I said, absolutely. Because none of us knew, of course, Millie was sick, but she would never sit in church. She would wrestle and flop and whine. And so that was a struggle when they came to visit. And it was such a struggle not to convey that to my children, because I never want them to think I'm comparing my grandchildren with Millie. I'm not. I never want them to think they're causing me pain. They're not. I want to be able to remember Millie and it be about Millie.
Yes.
If that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
We also have a precious little girl in our church right now that's 5. And she prances around in high heel shoes, sparkly high heel shoes all the time. And there's many, many Sunday mornings I look at her and I just think that's how Millie would be at this age. She would be every bit as sassy and fun. And so while I don't hurt now to see the other ones and I don't cry, but it brings a smile. It reminds me. And I think when your grief can move from stabbing agony to, oh, that reminds me of how good those times were, then that's when you know maybe your heart's healing.
That's right.
And I will say, Jill, the word healing has offended me for years because I wanted to say, I'm not healing. I'm not sick. There's nothing about me that's sick. I'm brokenhearted. But I can't come up with a better word to describe when your grief gets softer.
Yeah. Yeah. It is a healing process for sure. I don't think we'll be healed of our grief until we get to our, I guess I should say it this way. I don't think we'll be healed of our broken heart, or that our broken heart will be healed until we see our children again, but it's healing. It's in the process. That's the way I feel about mine anyway. That's my experience. So what did you discover as you approached and then passed Millie's first birthday in heaven?
I had a few things that stood out to me. One is everybody wants to do something big to remember their child, to honor their child. And I knew that I did too. And so I planned what was I going to do. You know, I've heard some of the different people say they buy birthday cakes or things. So what I chose to do was to buy 4 parties in a bag, meaning I took a gift bag and filled it with a gift, party supplies, plates, napkins, hats, whatever they needed. And then I went and bought 4 individual cakes, little tiny ones, and I drove them all to the hospital. And it was still during COVID, so they wouldn't let me take them in, but they would meet me down front and take them up to the children. And I just signed the card, help us celebrate Millie's 4th birthday. And that, leading up to that, there was a lot of anxiety. What am I going to feel like that day? Am I going to be just distraught? I thought I would be. And really, when I got to that day, I felt like almost a relief. And the relief was, today's not any worse than yesterday. Yesterday was bad. She's still dead. This morning's bad. She's still dead. But it's not any worse. This birthday's not devastating me. And neither was her first heaven day. Neither have the ones been since then. But something else I found is following her 2nd birthday in heaven, her 3rd birthday in heaven, we didn't have to do anything else big. I almost think sometimes as grieving parents, we put so much pressure on ourselves to do this right. We've got to make it special. We've got to show the world that we really did love our child. For the first time this year, I didn't decorate her grave for Christmas. Now, there's some mom guilt there, right? I want her grave decorated because I want people to look over there and go, somebody loved that little girl. But the other side of that, Millie's not there. When I'm decorating it, I'm doing it for the other people that are standing in the cemetery, looking around. Yet I'm not looking at their graves and judging whether or not they love their people. And so again, so much pressure to make sure we do these things, that if it's a blessing to you, do it. But if it's not, let it go. So she has flowers in her urn, and they're fall flowers that I did put there back in September or October, and I left them. It's not that her grave is bare, but I didn't go all out and do Christmas.
Right. And I think when you reach a point where you can be okay with that and comfortable with that, that's another step in that process of healing. And I agree with what you said about how we can tend to put a lot of pressure on ourselves to, quote unquote, perform even, around those birthdays and special days. I think social media has something to do with that too. We feel like we need to post something. But I think when those traditions become too much for us or are making us feel worse rather than better, it's okay to let go of them. And somebody may need to hear that today. So, how has your grief impacted your health?
I would say this is a big one for me personally. Over the last 4 years, my health has gone downhill. Now, if I had a physical, they would tell me, oh, you're healthy. My A1C is good. My whatever's good, But I definitely look a lot older. My hair and David's hair
That
got
happens to
grayer
us.
much
Yes.
quicker.
Yes.
We went from feeling like younger, energetic parents to all of a sudden we don't. We definitely feel like grandparents. We're definitely slower and achier. But the big thing that catches me is my weight. And every year around her heaven day and around her birthday, my weight creeps up. And even though I tell myself I'm not going to stress eat, I don't know if it's inflammation or what it is, but I just battle with just feeling inflamed and putting on weight. And then a big symptom has been chest pain.
Mm.
And I called the doctor. I said, I'm pretty
Sure.
sure I'm having heart problems.
Yeah.
My heart is really hurting. And he said, I don't believe it's heart problems. I believe it's anxiety. And once he clued into that, it gets much worse around her heaven day and around her birthday. And again, I know that day's not going to be any worse. It's not going to be any better. But my body just knows. It just, for some reason, knows those days are different. And, they've tried a lot of different things to help me through that, some medications, different things, but mainly it's rest, Jill. If I will slow down, if I will stay home and I will give myself time to be slow and methodical, I don't hurt near as bad. But anytime I feel the pressure starting to build, then I start having the chest pain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I'm glad you've gotten it checked out. Anybody that's listening that's having any kind of chest pain or physical issues like that, for sure, talk to your doctor about it. But yeah, it's amazing what just that emotion and stress can do to the body. It's so much. Grief is heavy. It's a heavy burden to carry, and it does impact your body.
It is definitely a heavy burden to bear. And I think I like to think I'll get back to how I felt before I lost her physically. And then I don't know if I will. And then that's another layer of grief. I not only grieve losing my child, I grieve losing the life we had together. I grieve losing my physical health. There's just so many things that all intertwine with grief.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Very complicated. In your book, you write a description of the first year of grief and the second year of grief. Would you mind just reading those descriptions to us?
First year grief feels excruciating. It hits you over and over and over with waves of tears. It tricks you into thinking you can do something, only to fall apart in the middle of the task. It causes your chest to feel like an elephant is sitting on it, and your lungs to be breathless. It's raw, fresh, and so painful. It covers you in fog and confusion. First year grief is so very hard. Second year grief is different than the first. It reminds you that you have to keep on living when you feel like your world has stopped. It allows you to go a few days before it takes another ugly strike at your heart. It hurts physically, but more with a persistent ache than a stabbing agony. It begins to clear out of your head and helps you realize if it hadn't been for the fog, you might not have survived the pain of the first 365 days. It's passed by many of the first and leaves you dreading many of the seconds. It makes you more aware of all you've lost. Second year grief is equally hard. As I read through scripture this morning, I noticed that many of the fathers of the Christian faith had very hard lives. They expressed their faith, but also their fears and doubts. They cried out for deliverance, but they also clung to God as they continued to wait. They allowed themselves the grace to freely live in a relationship with God, not just holding Him to the idea that everything must be perfect, much like the original garden. No hurts, no sickness, no sin, no misunderstandings, no silence, no loss, no death. Sadly, life here is not what God intended for us. Our lives will not meet that perfect standard until we meet Him in heaven. As much as we desire a life of ease, simplicity, and calm, we have to remember this world is not our forever home. We're not supposed to be so comfortable here that we're not longing for Jesus. Instead, we're to daily seek His face. We are to be eagerly looking for His return. We are to be joyfully working as the day grows closer. We Christians are to be hope givers by sharing our true struggles and our faith as we live them out. As the deer longs for the streams of water, so I long for you, O God, Psalms 42:1. If your heart's hurting like mine is, if your life seems a mess of broken dreams and disappointments, if you're wondering how you can survive with the pain you're living with, turn your eyes to Jesus, long for Him, follow Him, allow Him to carry you. Heaven is one day closer. November 2021.
So what words of encouragement would you have for our listeners now as you are in the fourth year of your grief?
To hang on, to know that how you feel that first year will make you doubt that your life will ever be good again. You'll wonder if you're losing your mind, and you're not. Your joy will return, but it will always carry the remembrance that you intimately know sorrow. With each moment of happiness, your brain will reserve a spot for the what if. You don't forget your precious child, but rather you remember that you carry them in your thoughts through every detail of life. I don't know if you ever had one of those World Book encyclopedias.
Oh, sure.
And they had a little picture of a frog. And then you would lay a clear transparency down and it would add his bones. And then you would lay another one down and it would add his muscles and then his blood veins and all these things. I was fascinated by that as a child. And what I think oftentimes that's what my life resembles now. There's a picture of what life truly is. And then there's a clear plastic overlay of where Millie would be in that picture. Within any given situation, I'm in the here and now, but I also can see my little girl standing over there on the side. I can see how she would be acting at church or where she would be in the room when the other children are playing.
Yeah, I love that. That's a great visual. I can see that too. Yeah, thank you for sharing that.
Yes.
So you began seeking community with other bereaved parents early on in your grief journey. What did you find helpful about being with other grieving moms?
That's right, Jill. I was very intentional to find various mom groups early on that were going to walk through my grief with me. Before I lost Millie, I didn't really know people that had lost children. I had a few friends that had lost babies, but it had been years ago. And in my mind, they were well past it.
Sure. That's what you thought.
That's what I thought.
Right.
My grandmother had lost my dad when I was 8 years old. And I remember back to how she never recovered from her grief. And I always wondered why. Why did she hang on to that grief so deeply? Now I get it, but I sure didn't get it then. So it was important to me to find women that did get it, that understood how I felt. That first group that I found was a 10-week Bible study that allowed me to process my loss with a curriculum and a group leader. And she would give us some instructions every week, and we would write something. Then we would share it during our time. And, she would kind of guide us because she was about 5 years ahead of us in her loss. So again, that was a mom that knew and understood. And those losses were from all different kinds of loss. The second group I joined was a local cancer moms group. And this group of ladies has become so dear to me. They're some of my closest friends. We laugh together. We cry together. We go on retreats together. We reminisce about our children. When I sit and think about their children, I think I may have only met one or two of their children. Yet I can tell you the quirks. I can tell you the fun things their kids do. I know what their kids liked, because we don't talk about our children like they're gone. We just talk about them like they're our children. And here's the neat things about their lives. We focus on their life. And even though we know their death stories, we don't focus on their deaths. I also drove to Springdale, Arkansas, to Michelle Moore's home and did the While We're Waiting Moms group. And it was a one-day retreat. But I have to share, Jill, when I walked up on Michelle's porch, I was so full of anxiety. I hear I've driven 4 or 5 hours from my home to go to this house of a lady that I don't know and ring her doorbell and to go in. And yet when she opened the door, she was a lady I already knew. And I knew her because I heard Joshua's story on this podcast.
Oh.
And I could envision him with her. And I could, when I walked in the hallway and saw the pictures on the wall, I knew Joshua.
Yeah.
I knew Michelle. I knew her husband. I was home. I was comfortable. I loved that. And that's what this podcast does for bereaved parents, is it connects us.
I love that.
It makes us not feel alone.
I don't think I knew that story. You may have told me and I had forgotten, but I love that.
Well, wow. I loved it too, because it just made me feel like, okay, this is good. And then when we came, be okay. Yeah, and David and I came to the refuge for a retreat, and Michelle was leading ours. Yeah. And so again, it was a friend. It was someone that knew me, that knew Millie's story.
Sure.
And that particular retreat, and I know y'all don't line it up like this, but that particular retreat, the majority of them were all cancer families.
Yeah. And that's unusual. Yeah.
Right. And it was interesting because we were the only child had cancer. The rest were all adults. But again, the Lord knew what we needed to sit with. And
that's right.
He knew who we needed to be with that day.
Yeah. He always does that. He always brings just the right group together. And it's just a really neat thing to see weekend after weekend. So you have become a fairly prolific writer. What started out as a blog has turned into several books now, and then you have been a guest poster on a lot of different sites and things like that. Tell us a little bit about the Millie Finds Her Miracle collection, and then tell us how we can find your books and find the things that you write.
Part of me becoming a writer, Jill, was when Millie was in treatment. My prayer over her was, Lord, heal her and let her tell of your goodness with her own mouth. But if you do not, I commit to telling it for her. If her healing's in heaven, I will make sure and tell of your goodness. And so much of the story is me trying to keep my commitment to the Lord. When I was writing the long book, I call it the long book because there's like 60,000 words in it. And I was writing, and it was a struggle because every single time I wrote, I was standing back in the middle of treatment. And every time I got to her death, I was standing beside her bed, watching her die again, over and over and over. And it came to a point where I'm like, I have to lay this down. I have to set it aside and do something different for a while. I can't take any more of this heavy grief. And so for about a year, I put that book up. But I knew the Lord wanted me to continue to write. And so I did write some things on some national blogs, and I still continued her Facebook page. But something that I felt like the Lord impressed upon my heart was every single day, there are children going on hospice. There are children dying, especially in the cancer world. And I want them not to be scared of what death looks like. So I wrote a book called Millie Finds Her Miracle. And it's a story about a little girl who searches everywhere for her miracle of healing. From her playground to the hospital, people around the world pray for her. And eventually, Jesus whispers her name, and she finds her miracle of healing in heaven. And It's a very simple book. It's written for young children. I contacted a mom who was also in the hospital, not at the same time with us. And actually, when I contacted her, she was in the stem cell transplant unit with her little boy fighting neuroblastoma. And that was scary to ask this mom, can you illustrate a book about my child dying from a cancer your child has?
Yeah.
Yeah. I said, if it's too much, I understand. Sure. But if you would be willing to do this, I just want you to draw what you see. Because she sat in those same rooms, and I mean in the very same beds that we sat in. She knew what Millie went through because her little boy had gone through that same thing. After she agreed to illustrate the book, I found out later on she was a bereaved mom, and her child had passed away earlier on, a younger infant. But she knew my heartache, and here she had this fear that her second child would pass away. Now, I am so grateful to say that now he is healed. He's been in remission for a long time, and everything looks wonderful. And it's so wonderful to think that he's going to get to grow up.
Yeah, praise God.
That started our Millie Finds Her Miracle, as you said, collection, I guess. Some of her prayer partners wanted to gift the book. And so we did an opportunity for them to purchase a book. And then I watch for children who are going on to hospice, or I watch for families who have recently had a child pass away. And I will mail the book to them free of charge because the prayer partners buy it. And then I pay for the shipping. But I always include a letter from Millie. And obviously it's not from Millie, it's from me. But I do sign it from Millie with help from her mama. And the letter says something along the lines of, I know you have a sibling in heaven. Did you know when I got to heaven, there was no more pain? There was no more sadness. We're all happy in heaven. We sing. We laugh. We're here with Jesus. And we'll be waiting for you to get here too. Love, Millie, with help from her mama. And I make sure to personalize it. So I always ask for the siblings' names. And I always ask for the child's name that's passed away so that I can put that in the letter. When I print the letter out, there's a picture of Millie on the letter. And there's a picture of some of the graphics from the book so that the child can tie it all together. And my hope is that when you read this book to your child, it's a sweet, non-scary introduction to death if your child hasn't passed away yet. If your child has passed away, my hope is that you're able to say, just like your sister's in heaven, just like Millie is. To give a small child a visual of, where did my sibling go? I wanted something that connected some dots, but did it in a way that wasn't so sad. Because they understand grief. My little boy understands grief better than anybody. I mean, and the stuff that comes out of his mouth is so profound. He knows.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's wonderful. And it is a beautiful book. Very well done.
Thank you.
I would recommend it highly. So where can people find your books?
They can find all the books on my website, which is milliesmiracle.net. They can also find them on Amazon. I will say I have a small devotion book of 21 devotions that came off of her Facebook page over the years. I gathered them together and printed those, and there's a matching journal. And everything has the butterfly. I neglected to tell you about the butterfly, but in Millie Finds Her Miracle, there is a butterfly that represents her miracle. And we hid one on each page in the illustrations so the children can search for those, really be led into the book as they go page by page.
Yeah, very well done. And that's why I referred to it as the collection, because I knew there was a journal and all of that went with it. So, all right, well, we'll put those links in the show notes so people can get a copy of that if they'd like. And also, your book, She Died, I Didn't. We'll put a link to that in there as well, the new book.
Thank you.
All right, is there anything else you'd like to share before we go?
I do think I want to share that I believe that writing and sharing my story was one of the greatest helps to me in surviving the loss of Millie. I know not everyone's a writer. Not everyone even feels like they can journal. They can't get their thoughts out. But by being able to share my story repeatedly I think it helped my brain accept the trauma. I've said it again, I've said it again. It's helped my brain understand this is real, this loss is real. And that to someone that's not a bereaved parent, that probably sounds back to crazy again. We know it's real. But there's days we wake up and it's like, is this real? How can this be who we are? And I think just by saying it repeatedly, by sharing my story, by practicing what I'm going to say, it's just helped me be comfortable with my grief. In turn, being comfortable with my grief has allowed me to help other parents through their grief. It helped me work through all my emotions. It challenged me to solidify my beliefs, and it allowed me to use this pain for God's glory, which then brings Romans 8:28 to life. As we know, all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are called according to his purpose. And as we say over and over on While We're Waiting, all this is not good. Our children dying is not good. But what are we going to do with this pain? We need to use our pain for his glory. People are watching us. And as they watch us, our testimony can be one of faith, or it can not. It can be one of bitterness. And it's a hard choice to make, especially when we hurt so bad.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Well, your book, I think, will help people as they're grappling with that choice to be able to make a good choice on how they steward their grief. So thank you for being such a voice in the bereaved parent community of encouragement and pointing people to hope, pointing people to the miracle, even if the miracle is not the one that we were hoping for. But it is a miracle nonetheless. And thank you for that. I appreciate you.
Well, thank you. Thank you for allowing me to talk about Millie.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's my pride and joy. Her middle name is Joy.
Absolutely. That's right. Just like my
Yes.
Hannah Joy.
That's right.
That's right. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jill.
Thank you so much for joining me for another episode of the While We're Waiting Hope After Child Loss podcast. If this podcast has been a blessing to you, please take just a moment to leave a rating or a review, and please feel free to share it with someone you know who might be helped by it. We're so grateful for all of you who come back and listen every week, and those of you who may be listening for the very first time. I hope God has used it to encourage you today and to help you live well while you're waiting.